It's Monday, November 4th, 2024, and tomorrow is Election Day. Welcome to our very last Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, when will we actually know the results of the election? So after all the ballots are cast and the counting starts, the question on everyone's mind is, when will we know who won? And I wish I could say that we'll know on election night or even the day after, but we won't. So at best, we'll know Wednesday night, maybe, and there are a lot of reasons for that, and mostly it'll come down to how the swing states are able to count their votes. And I've talked about before about how some states have already been counting early in mail-in votes, and a couple weeks ago I talked with Liz Dye about how there were already challenges in courts to some of those votes, mainly in Pennsylvania, when a federal judge just tossed out a lawsuit to separate absentee ballots from the rest of the ballots, which is part of what Liz called these point-shaving ballots in some of these extremely close states, but we'll come back to what's happened in the courts again later. I thought today would be a good day to look at the swing states, which are, again, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona, and how they're going to be counting their votes. I also want to say here that when we talk about vote totals right after the election, we're talking about unofficial results, because yes, you'll hear news outlets call these races for one candidate or another, but really elections aren't official until a state's election board or a secretary of state or whoever runs your elections in your state certifies and finalizes that election. But let's start with Wisconsin. Wisconsin is expected to have its count about Wednesday night, at least that's according to an election official who talked to CNN. In 2020, only about 70% of the votes were in by midnight there. Now, Wisconsin was among the states where election workers aren't allowed to count mail-in ballots until election night, so like 2020, we should expect some shift in the vote when workers get to those, usually much later in the night, likely after midnight. Now, that's what happened in 2020, where almost two-thirds of the votes were mailed in because of the pandemic, and most of those were from Democrats. So the totals jumped up for Biden, which caused Trump to claim there was cheating happening. Now, that wasn't true, but this time, because about half the number of ballots were mailed in as in 2020, Trump hasn't really been beating the drum about fraud in absentee voting as much, which has left some officials there hoping that they'll be able to count ballots faster and without interruption this time. But election experts say that we should expect what's called a red mirage or a blue wave. It just means that you're going to see a lead for one party and then a lead taking over for another party. Usually that shift is a Republican to a Democrat shift when we're talking about this kind of voting. And that's only because Democrats tend to trust absentee and mail-in voting more than Republicans, so they're more likely to use it. In Michigan, the votes are expected to come in a little faster than previous years. The voting laws there were changed to let election workers start counting those mail-in and early votes 8 days before the election day and on election day while voting is happening too. So one election official in Detroit, where some of the more violent attempts to stop the count by Trump supporters happened in 2020, quote, "We wanted to make sure the lion's share were reported by the 11 o'clock news. We were successful in achieving that goal, and pre-processing helped tremendously." The state's Secretary of State said that she expects results to take until about Wednesday, but more like in the afternoon or early evening instead of late Wednesday night. Pennsylvania, the all-important Keystone state and the cornerstone for both campaigns' main winning strategies, is also among those states that does not allow for early processing, meaning the count will be longer. Election officials there do expect the count to be done by Wednesday night, but say that it could stretch into Thursday this week. The Harris campaign sent out an email as well, saying they expect that it could stretch into Thursday, if not a little bit longer than that. Now, there are worries about what might happen again if there's a surge in Democratic votes late on election night, again, because Democrats lately have been more trusting of mail-in and absentee voting. On top of that, Trump has already been claiming as many as 20,000 mail-in votes were fraudulent in Pennsylvania, and he's been urging law enforcement to, quote, do its job. And just yesterday, Trump made more claims about fraud while holding a rally there.
Or so, but in Lancaster, they found 2,600 ballots, all done by the same hand. In other words, The same exact penmanship, the same hand, the same everything. It was all done by the same pen, the exact same pen. And then they go and they say, well, this is a conspiracy theorist. It's a terrible thing that's happened to our country.
So what Trump said there isn't remotely true, just like the 20,000 fraudulent ballot claim. What actually happened was the system worked. In what Trump was just saying, election officials say they found about 2,500 voter registration applications before they were made official, so not ballots. Also, the registration doesn't necessarily mean fraud. It could just mean a host of things, including people trying to register again, but they forgot that they were already registered, or trying to register in Pennsylvania because they live there now, or they're students, but not realizing that they were registered in another state. But it's that kind of rhetoric from Trump that has election officials nervous. Okay, heading south, North Carolina and Georgia are expected to be in by the early morning hours on Wednesday. Georgia is expected to have its votes in quickly because they've been able to count those votes again early for a few days now, and a new law on the books requires the state to report those numbers by 8 p.m. Eastern. And the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, says they think the rest of the votes will be counted by 10:30 on election night, which, given the delays in Georgia the last time, is a high bar. And those delays in 2020 were things like a broken water main that caused an evacuation, and like in Michigan, fights over poll watchers and challengers who showed up during the counting process. Now, in North Carolina, these things are going to be a little trickier. While early and absentee votes that were sent in before Election Day are required to be reported between 7:30 and 9:30 p.m., any that come in after that will have to wait, but state officials expect this Election Day total to come in by about 1 a.m. The tricky thing will be how many votes are going to trickle in because of Hurricane Helene. So those who mail in their votes, drop them off outside of their home counties because their home county election offices were wiped out, or who vote on a provisional ballot, which is what you call a ballot that you get, but they still need to make sure that you are who you say you are before it can get counted. Those ballots will have a full 10 days after the election to come in and still be counted. And now, given the misinformation surrounding Hurricane Helene that's still poisoning relief efforts there, fears that misinformation could just skip over to election misinformation and impact the vote counting are real fears, especially if counting because of the impacts of Hurricane Helene take a long time. And speaking of a long time, Nevada and Arizona are expected to take days, if not more than a week. So in Nevada, most voters vote by mail. And like I've been saying, it takes a long time to count all of those because remember, those votes have to be opened. They have to be separated and sorted and then counted and recorded. And like I've said before, that might not seem like a big process for a single vote, but when you times that by millions, it's a lot. And election officials there allow for mail-in votes to be accepted until November 9th, so the end of the week here, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day. And on top of all of that, Nevada doesn't allow vote totals to be released until the last voter in line has voted after the polls have closed, which in 2020 was at about 1 a.m., although counting can start before that. Now, finally, Arizona is going to be trouble. So totals in Arizona aren't allowed to be reported until all the precincts are in or until 1 hour after the polls close, whichever comes first, and that's usually around 10 p.m. But a Republican-backed voting law that just went into effect this year could open the door to fraud claims and will really slow down the process. So that law forces election workers to count the number of mail-in ballots before they're tallied, meaning they just have to give account of the envelopes that get sent in, not what's inside them. Now, the theory behind this was they wanted to be able to match the number of envelopes to the number of ballots tallied in this election, but most election officials consider this to be wildly unnecessary, if not downright dangerous, and a way to bolster fraud claims, because human error in just hand counting these envelopes is no doubt going to occur. This law was sort of slipped into a bipartisan package of election laws that were designed to help Arizona meet federal standards for posting results sooner, but obviously this won't actually help that. And election officials think that it will take up to 13 days to get the final results. Okay, so those are the states. What are the candidates doing? Well, exactly what you think. Trump, his campaign, and other Republicans have been laying the groundwork, like I've been talking about before, to contest the election if things look bad for them. And Trump will likely do exactly what he did in 2020, which is claim an early victory if it seems at all plausible that he'll be winning, and maybe not even then. We can also expect to hear a lot about the lawsuits from Trump and Republicans, the lawsuits that are the placeholders for potential real challenges. Expect to hear about lawsuits and state-level changes that have been stopped by judges before Election Day as being unfair or called election interference. And I wouldn't be surprised if things get really tight in a few of these states, particularly Michigan and Pennsylvania and maybe Georgia at this point, that Trump calls his supporters again to descend on where the count is happening, though law enforcement is better prepared in most states this time around. It's also here worth noting what the U.S. Supreme Court has signaled. So last week, the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court, in a denial of a Pennsylvania lawsuit that was brought by the Republican National Committee, they said essentially that they were going to leave the door open for potential election challenges and that they would be met with at least a lukewarm, if not a warm welcome to the highest court. And these are the same justices that essentially said that Trump had full immunity, although it's not really full immunity. But just so we know that that's in the water supply and floating around out there, that Election Day, even when it's all said and done and the count is over, probably won't be the end of this election. On the other side of the aisle, Democrats say they have a plan in place this time to fight those misinformation campaigns, with people ready to counter fraud claims on social media and on news outlets that will be on late and overnight. And Democrats have also been building a list of lawyers to counter challenges, and some have already been filed in courts preemptively. Harris has already laid out her plan, and she talked about it yesterday. Here it is.
So here we are on the Sunday before the election, and I would ask, in particular, people who have not yet voted, to not fall for his tactic, which I think includes suggesting to people that if they vote, their vote won't matter. Suggesting to people that somehow the integrity of our voting system is not intact so that they don't vote. And again, I think that it is a tactic. It is meant to distract from the fact that we have and support free and fair elections in our country. We did in 2020. He lost. And the systems that are in place for this election in 2024 have integrity. They are good systems, and the vote of the people will determine the outcome of this election, and everyone must know that their vote is their power to determine the outcome of the election, and their vote will count. It does matter. Thank you.
And then that is it for election night. And before you head to vote, just remember that it is okay to unplug until results are announced. It's okay to go to bed on election night if things aren't coming in, and they definitely won't be coming in till after midnight. And it's also okay to do what you need to do to be okay. The only thing that isn't okay is not voting. I, however, will be up all night watching results come in. I'll pop up on social media with updates from time to time, and hopefully things go smoothly, and this really will be the last mini episode, at least for a little while. And with that, that is it for this MIMS mini. And I want to thank you all for listening to these every single day for the last 90 days. I started not knowing if I could do this, whether anyone would listen, and the number of you who have reached out and said that you feel more informed and feel a little better in some way about this election because you've been listening has just meant the world to me. So thank you. That being said, Make It Make Sense isn't going anywhere. You'll still get full episodes every Friday, including this Friday, so make sure you're following the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to it on. Rate and review as always. Make sure that you liked and subscribed and hit the bell for notifications if you're a watcher on YouTube too. And if you do want more of this sort of MIMS mini style content, I'm going to be doing all that over on the Make It Make Sense Substack. So if you want that, go ahead and subscribe now. Most of that stuff is going to be behind the $5 paywall, but it's just $5 a month. There are other options too where you can pay $50 up front for the year, and then one that's a little bit more if you want more interaction with me, but you guys can check that out for yourselves. And then, as always, please continue to share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll talk to you on Friday.